This is the Nitro Deck Plus from Cracked, a new and improved version of the Nitro Deck they released late last year with a number of subtle improvements. Some things are obvious, for instance, swapping the right stick and ABXY positions for more ergonomics. That is something we're going to talk about with these, but there are a number of other things that this adds on that are not immediately apparent compared to the original. To begin with, let's talk about what hasn't really changed compared to the original. Like the first Nitro Deck, the Nitro Deck Plus is a simple way of turning your Switch into a larger device, making it more comfortable for people with larger hand sizes, while also giving it just a bit more of a full body design, almost similar to a Steam Deck. And it's pretty straightforward to use. You just take your Switch tablet, slide it in the main body, and you're good to go. While there has been a slight rearrangement of the buttons and sticks with the right stick and ABXYs flipping, the actual feeling of most of the buttons and sticks remains about the same. The D-pad, ABXYs, sticks all feel pretty much identical. The only one that feels a little different to me is that the L and Rs have a slightly more satisfying click. So that's an improvement. One thing that has remained the same and is really the only button on these that I'm not as big of a fan of, and this does come down a little bit to personal preference, the triggers. They just use that very kind of short travel distance with a very soft, almost mushy finish. And in fact, even using their own software for seeing how it reads pull distances, it doesn't count as a full pull until you're really applying a little bit extra pressure at the very bottom. It's just not a style that I personally like very much. All the other buttons and sticks, though, absolutely solid. On top of all these traditional ones that you would have for regular Switch inputs, like the original Nitro Deck, you also have a set of 4 remappable back buttons that you can just rest your fingers on while holding it this style. There's something very interesting, actually, about how the ergonomics of this thing works out to where these feel slightly different to me. We'll talk about that in a second. That aside, port-wise, we also have the same 2 ports that were present on the original. You've got an input that can be used for charging it and an output that can be used for either using it as a controller or, in this case, unlocking one of its new features, acting as a dock as well. And then on the back is also this little eject button, which is how you free the Switch from the Nitro Deck. One interesting little change here right away is that on the original Nitro Deck, the eject button was kind of awkward because it didn't really eject the Switch, it just freed it. So you had to push up and hold it and then pull the Switch out. It wasn't awful, it just felt a little awkward. One of the updates that the Nitro Deck Plus has made is that by pushing this eject button all the way up, it actually does detach the Switch and pop it up a little bit, making it a lot easier to remove and requiring you to do a bit less gripping against the screen. As for changes, there are some pretty big ones, and the first one I want to focus on is that change of ergonomics with swapping the ABXY and the right stick. One complaint that some people had, myself included, is that because of the way the grip shape of this controller is handled, it made having the right stick on the lower part of the body not particularly comfortable to use. You could kind of rearrange your grip in a way to make it work, but it still just wasn't quite right. It just caused your thumb to bunch up a little bit. And so by moving it up here, just like the left side, it ends up becoming a much more natural resting place for your thumbs with this grip style. The trade-off here is that now the ABXY buttons are in that slightly less comfortable position, which I will say, between the two, I think the ABXY works out a little bit better, but I do find myself oftentimes actively trying to avoid using the lower half of the controller, or just straight up adjusting my grip style. Particularly if I'm playing a game where ABXY has way heavier use than the right stick, which is pretty much any game that isn't first-person view, I find myself adjusting my grip style to where I'm holding the hand lower, and it ends up being pretty comfortable to use. The only downside of that is it does also shift the way your hand rests on the back buttons, which can end up feeling just a little bit more awkward to use, and maybe have you just rely on using one of them rather than both. To be honest, in terms of like the peak way that I've used this controller that has felt comfortable, it has been me completely abandoning the lower half section of the controller. This thing feels its best to me when I'm resting my thumbs on the left and right sticks and relying on the back buttons as my ABXY input. It actually ends up being a pretty effective system if you can rewire your brain to focus on playing that style versus using the more traditional front-facing buttons. But obviously, that's not going to be everyone's preference. Speaking of the back buttons, the Nitro Deck Plus also features an additional pair of buttons that are not present on the original, which are these ones located on the left and right sides of the stick, which is interesting. Normally the main point of bonus buttons like this is to make sure you don't have to take your thumbs off the sticks at any point, which is possible with these, but it is a style that, to be honest, I've never been a huge fan of because it doesn't feel quite as intuitive. For instance, you might be tempted to just take your thumb off the stick for a moment, then just press the button really quickly, which defeats the purpose of the bonus. You might want to curl your finger and press it, which isn't very comfortable. Really, the main method you're supposed to use for this is extending your finger up and then just kind of pressing in on the side, which these side buttons are flush enough that I feel like I do have to put a little bit extra effort in to make sure that I confirm fully pushing down. They absolutely do work as an additional option, but I didn't find them to be nearly as convenient as the 4 back buttons. I think what ends up being one of the most interesting updates about this controller, though, is the fact that this can now also operate completely as a switch dock. Now, just like with a traditional dock, in order to use it this way, you do have to have power running into it at the same time, so it's not going to be a single cable setup, but the idea is you plug your switch charger into the input over here, you plug a USB-C to HDMI adapter, and then plug an HDMI into that, plug that into your TV, and you're good to go. And this does make, I think, for a very interesting all-in-one solution of something that is a useful on-the-go handheld that is more comfortable, while also being a dock when you need it on the go. There are certainly smaller portable dock options that have already been out there on the market, but this being able to do both the dock and an improved handheld mode is a very nice double feature. Now, with using it as a dock, I do find it also interesting that there's basically 2 different ways you could do this. You could prop it on its kickstand and just have it work like a dock where you're using a wireless controller, or if you have long enough cables and it's not too awkward of a situation, you could also just be still holding on to this while looking at your TV and use it like a controller directly. Honestly, out of all the updates and upgrades that the Nitro Deck Plus has received, while there's still a couple more I want to talk about, this is my favorite new feature. Now, the last final addition is Bluetooth built into the controller so you can connect it with your phone to use the Cracked app. This is something that was missing on the original Nitro Deck. There was no app level customization available for the system. With this version, though, you can connect to your phone and access a bunch of different additional features. This does also play into one of the big running themes with Cracked products in that you can also scan the device and register it into a digital library of what accessories you own and find out some fun stats like what production line number it is and how rare it is. Personally, not my whole kind of thing, but I've seen a lot of people really be excited by this particular idea with Cracked products. But what does really interest me in is the app level customization. Again, this was not something you could do with the original Nitro Deck. It is a feature on their dedicated controller, the Neo S. But with the app, you're able to do a number of different things, like updating the firmware of the controller. You can do shoulder button sensitivity adjustments. You can turn on and off having a dead zone on the stick. So if you want it to be as reactive as possible, you can turn off it having a dead zone. So the moment you apply any pressure, it detects it. You're also able to access a remap menu, so you have an easier, simple way of immediately remapping any of the back buttons or the 2 side ones. And you can also choose to adjust the rumble level of the controller between a high, medium, low, or just having it entirely off. The Nitro Deck Plus is interesting to me because it's continuing this trend I've been seeing with a lot of Cracked products where I really like the idea here, and it is a good product. Like, I don't want to be like, oh no, this thing's bad. Like, no, it is a very solid, good, comfortable way of using the controller. There's just always something about it that holds it back a little bit, oftentimes related to ergonomics. Again, this is something that can be very comfortable when you're playing games that are very focused on twin stick use, and it can certainly be an option for more traditional games where the front-facing buttons play a much larger role. It's just not quite as comfortable as I would really want it to be. At the same time, there are other updates and changes here that I do like. You know, while it's not quite as comfortable as I want it to be for some playstyles, I do think it's an improvement over the original Nitro Deck. The ability to double as a dock, I think, is a very large benefit, having additional app-level customizations on top. There's a lot of stuff that's being added here for a controller that's not really being charged much more than its original, especially when you look at how this stacks up compared to the collector edition designs they've done for the original Nitro Deck. So it is a solid, overall good option. It's just one where I see what they were aiming and going for, and I feel like they're just a little shy of it. It's good, it's just something where I think with the right adjustments and different approaches to some things, it could have just been really at the top for this style of controller. So those are my thoughts on the Nitro Deck Plus. If you are interested in grabbing one of these, I do have links posted down below in the description. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button to let me know, subscribe if you haven't yet, and until next time, I'll see you all later.